A word of caution. I titled my sermon, Words Matter. But I want to reassure you that this is in no way, shape, or form any kind of a political message. I don't believe it. Came to me probably because it's been in our media. You think, oh, I've got a great idea for a title, and then you realize, well, it's been bandied around all week. No wonder it's stuck in the back of my mind. But words really do matter. You know and I know that it takes a long time to build something up. Whether that's a relationship, whether that's a civilization, whether that's a church community. It takes a lot of time, prayer, hard work to build something up. And it only takes a few words or actions of people to tear down that which has taken many, many years, sometimes decades, centuries to build up. You see that all over the world. You see that in our own relationships. Sometimes words that are poorly chosen can bring so much pain and so much hurt to a relationship that it damages it to the point that perhaps it doesn't survive. So words are very, very powerful. And if you ever doubt the importance of words or the power that one has with language, immerse yourself in a culture where you have no language, you cannot communicate by word or by written word. And you will see very, very quickly, as I did in Japan, that you're silent. The simple task becomes overwhelming. So we understand that language, communication is important. But words are not the only way that we communicate. In fact, words comprise only 20% of our communication. The other 80% is conveyed by gesture, by our body language, as they call it, smiles, the things, actions, the things that we do, the way that we treat people, the way that we look, act, behave, conveys far more. Think about an animal who can't speak. Our animals don't have words, and yet when you come to know an animal, you know if something's bothering them or what needs to happen, because they communicate in ways with their actions and with what they do. A little child is the same way before they're able to speak. If they have a need, you generally know about it fairly quickly. If you don't address the need, the volume increases. And so you are brought before you again and again and again. Sometimes it can be a challenge trying to figure out what that need is. And similarly, when people come to the end of their life, or when people, it doesn't necessarily the end of their life, but I'm thinking of people that come to a point where they're dealing with dementia, and they have needs, they can't always communicate them in the same way that you and I understand with words. But those needs and those things are communicated. Sometimes we become so hung up on words that we don't hear the other things. Other times, a person's actions and body language are speaking so loudly that you almost want to turn to them and say, well, you're yelling so loudly at me that I can't hear anything you're saying. Because, and I know that all of us have had that situation where, I'm fine, really, I'm just fine. Well, you know, that person's not fine at all, but they're not going to tell you. And that's an example where body language is speaking so loudly that we really can't even hear what the person is saying. Well, let me look at this story that we just read from John's Gospel. And I think I've maybe said this before, but John's Gospel is a little different than the others. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are known as the Synoptic Gospels. And when you look at them, you'll see basically the same stories in the different books, just told in a slightly different fashion. They're not in order. Mark was the first book that was written, and it's much more direct. There's not as much language, so I always say that Mark is kind of the Coles Notes. Remember those old Coles Notes that you get and skip reading the book because you could just read the Coles Notes? It's kind of the Coles Notes of the three synoptic gospels. And like anybody, if I'm writing a piece of work or you're writing a piece of work, we're influenced, aren't we, by the culture, the time in which we live. And we see that when we read people's writings. Well, Matthew was a tax collector, so we see a lot of writings about money in his book. And Luke was a physician, that was his job, so we see a lot of the healing stories in Luke. And so we see a trimmed-down version in Mark, and similar stories in the other three Gospels. Now John, the Gospel of John was written much later, probably about 60 years later, I think. And so in John, we have a lot more sort of philosophical thoughts. So we have long soliloquies of kind of poetry and monologue. Some people really like the Gospel of John. So for some people, it's their favorite. Some people really don't like it because it's find it a bit too philosophical, too wordy. They like to sort of get to the point. So if you want to if you're a get-to-the-point person, go to Matthew, Mark, or Luke. If you like sort of philosophy and language, then John is probably your guy. But the disciples were so much like you and I, weren't they? This is what makes them so believable. They were not mental or moral giants. They were pretty human. And Jesus would be talking to them about something really important. And they'd say, well, what's for dinner? You know how you're having a really serious discussion with somebody? Oh, so did you put the dog out this morning? Could we stay with this? Well, here, once again, in this verse, he's doing the same thing. Because Jesus is giving sort of a parallel thought. He's using the language of the day, but he's speaking in a metaphorical sense, talking about the bread of heaven. Now, the disciples were very much concrete people. Oh yeah, the bread of heaven. That's what our ancestors had in the wilderness. The manna. Oh, okay, is that what you're going to give us? Jesus, no. You strive for the bread that doesn't end. So he's talking in this sort of philosophical language. Some people would call it psychobabble today, or Tuesday, because he's using the same words, but infusing a different meaning with them. And so once again, the disciples are asking, well, how are we going to see this? What's the sign? Tell me the sign. They were really, really great people. They wanted to have it right in their hands. Because then they could know it and understand it and control it. Sometimes it's harder to understand this abstract thinking, isn't it? And we know that as we educate children, that there's a certain level where they can begin to move into that abstract thinking, but that doesn't come right away. If you're trying to work with abstract thinking with little tykes, you're both going to, probably both will be really frustrated because it's a concept beyond their intellectual level at that point. And similarly, if you're speaking with adults and using very, very simple concrete images, they may or may not be offended because they are able to do more abstract thinking. So the disciples are asking, well, what is this? What's going to be the sign? And, our ancestors ate bread in the wilderness. That must be the sign. And Jesus says, no, it wasn't Moses that gave you that. It was God, that constant man. So I was thinking, particularly as I was working this week and as I was just reading the passage, it struck me so powerfully that at this time of the year, we have so many signs, don't we? And children built this basket just by putting stuff in. And it's a pretty nice basket. Food and fruit. I was driving over to Waterloo on Wednesday, and I always take the back way because I like to kind of relax on country roads. And as I was driving along, and I've seen trees like this week in London, but I haven't seen any colors to speak of. And I was driving along, and all of a sudden there's this splash of red in a tree that's completely green, except for this splash of red. And a bit further on, there's a big splash of orange. And I was so struck by that. I mean, it happens every year, but all of a sudden it really touched me. vibrant colors all along. Just to remind us that these are the things that are always there. These are the things that are important. Good times come and good times go. And bad times come and bad times go. But God is the steady. That's why we light this candle. This time of the year we see the leaves, the fruits, the flower, the fall flowers, everything coming in. And we're reminded of God's bounty. And Thanksgiving isn't just one day of the year. There's been a lot of writing in the secular world these days about living in an attitude of gratitude, consciously giving thanks. And I think that that's really the only way that we can live and be at peace, is to constantly be living in a thankful way. Each day there are things in our lives for which we can give thanks. And even on the toughest days, and you've had them and I've had them, when we feel like the world is crashing in around us, there's always at least one thing that we can give thanks for. And it's important for us to find that and to make that gratitude and that sense of living out of gratitude a daily practice. Thanksgiving simply reminds us, because we bring together all kinds of colorful fruits and vegetables and leaves, and there's all kinds of reminders of the things that we are thankful for. In the last couple of nights, as I've been watching the news, and I imagine you have too, seeing the incredible hurricanes that have been happening in the Caribbean and in southern United States. And as I was watching it last night, I was remembering that, we are so lucky in Canada. I do not remember once dealing with a hurricane or a flood or a tornado or any of these natural disasters. The closest I've ever come to that kind of natural disaster was a forest fire that burned very close to where we were living at the time. And fortunately, we did not have to evacuate. The orders were out to evacuate. But the winds changed just in time, and we did not have to evacuate. That's the closest I've been to a natural disaster. And I got thinking, particularly when I saw the pictures flash up from Haiti. And Haiti was pummeled a few years ago with, was it a hurricane? Yeah, earthquake. And now a hurricane. And the place is in ruins. And it is the poorest country in the Western world. And I just was so overwhelmed. I thought, how much more can one nation, one people survive? And that's when it struck me, how lucky we are here in Canada. And how I just started going through my mind of how many natural disasters have I ever been through? And I think most of us can say that. So we have much to give thanks for. And it's out of that sense of thankfulness, that sense of gratitude, that we're then able to reach out to others and to be God's people and God's disciples and to live out of faithfulness when we see what's happening around us. Those are the things that matter. It's not the fact that my iPhone didn't work this morning, or I couldn't get online, or I'm wearing the same clothes that I wore last Sunday, or whatever. Those things aren't important. What's important is noticing those leaves, is speaking to that person, signing the petition, thinking about somebody in Haiti or Aleppo or all of those other places and praying for them that things may be different. Because I can bet that even the people that are living in those horrible situations each day are finding something to be thankful for. When I worked downtown in London among people that were very much on the margins and had nothing, even when I would talk to them, there would be something that they would say that they were thankful for. And I was always awestruck. They would say, Catherine, I'm so thankful that. One time it was, my friend will let me sleep on her couch when I come home from the hospital. Can you imagine? That's all she had. But she was so grateful. And so Thanksgiving reminds us about humility. It reminds us that there always is a sign